If you place these cannons on stitched ships, even the back kick of a cannon, the reverse blast of the cannon, was enough to loosen the ropes so that the ships would not be able to deal. Shivratri last year, we put the boat into the water. In fact, we did it at midnight because that's when the tide came in. So it was almost exactly at Shivratri moment. And to our great relief, the ship floated, screaming to the Indian Coast Guard, mentioning that there is a strange ship, very likely a Pakistani intruder, that was sailing through this and heading towards heading towards the Pakistan border. In fact, the joke was that if you went to the toilet in Sea State 4, you got a Mahavir Chakra. If you went to the toilet at Sea State 5, you got a Paramvir Chakra. And anything above Sea State 6 and above was Veer Gati. It's physically exhausting. The ship is continuously rolling back and forth, as I said. Just getting in and out of the toilet, as I pointed out to you, was not a trivial thing. And then, of course, raising the sails, bringing it down the sails, going in and out of the hull in heavy weather, doing even daily tasks like changing your clothes.
We are privileged to invite Shri Sanjeev Sanyal, esteemed member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Honorable Prime Minister of India. I would like to invite him to deliver his lecture titled The Voyage of INSV Kondinya. Sir, the stage is yours.
So let me begin by first thanking the Honorable Governor, the trustees of Indian Museum, and the director for inviting me here today on their 212th Foundation Day to deliver the Nathaniel Wallich lecture. Now, who was Nathaniel Wallich? I think that's important to tell you the story of this man because in some ways he would have been very particularly tickled by the lecture I'm going to give you. Because you see, although he came here and he was one of the founders of the Indian Museum 212 years ago, he was actually born a German Jew in Denmark. And he trained as a surgeon and came to India to work in the Danish colony of Srirampur, not far from Kolkata, where just 6 months or less than a year after he arrived here as a surgeon, the English East India Company took over Srirampur from the Danish, and he found himself as a prisoner of the East India Company. So he actually spent 2 years as a prisoner of the English East India Company till the authorities discovered that they were running a shortage of surgeons. So he was lucky, and so he got freed, and he began working as a surgeon for the English East India Company. Now, while he was doing this, he developed an interest in botany. And as a result of that, he became quite a famous botanist. In fact, he became one of the most famous botanists of his time. In fact, he was also, for a while, running the botanical gardens across the river. He had a role to set up the botanical gardens in Singapore. And he, of course, excelled in his own profession and became one of the best-known surgeons in the world. Now, while he was, as I said, practicing medicine, doing botany, about 212 years ago, also decided to set up Asia's first museum, the museum that you are now sitting in. So I think he would have been particularly tickled with the idea, as a surgeon who became famous as a botanist and is today remembered as a founder of a museum, that I'm going to speak as an economist about the history of shipbuilding in India, and about a voyage as a sailor, which I just completed a few weeks ago from India to Porbandar on a 4th century ship. So, ladies and gentlemen, the lecture I'm going to give you today is about INSV Kondinya and a symbol of India's maritime history. Now, India, of course, has a very old maritime history. Just upstairs, you will see that our maritime history goes back at least 5,000 years. So, thousands of years ago, Indians were sailing the Indian Ocean, and it's not by chance that India is the only country in the world which actually has an ocean named after it. And Indians were sailing to Oman. They were sailing all the way to Mesopotamia, from the Harappan cities like Dholavira, Lothal, Dwarka, and so on. But the problem is, we don't actually know what those ancient ships look like. The very earliest ships of that period, we don't know what they look like. Interestingly, we know what their anchors look like because they were made of stone, but the ships themselves were made of wood. And we don't have any depictions of ocean-going ships. We do have some depictions of riverboats, and let me tell you that, at least to somebody who is into ship design, that a riverboat looks about as different from an ocean-going ship as a golf stick looks from a tennis racket. So let me assure you that those sometimes claimed riverboats that they could cross the oceans is absolutely incorrect. So the real problem that I began to look at some years ago when I was writing a book called The Ocean of Churn, and some of you seem to have read that, was that what did our earliest ships look like? Because there's a lot of evidence of early Indian maritime activity, which didn't end with the Harappans. It carried on into the Iron Age and into the historical period. We have lots of evidence of Indians sailing through to the Greco-Roman world, to ports in the Red Sea, trading with the Arabs, trading with the Persian Empire. On the other side, trading with the Javans, the Majapahit Empire in Java, with the Srivijaya Empire of Sumatra, with the Chams of Vietnam, with the Khmers, and all the way through to Korea and Japan. So what were the ships that they used looking like? That is the question that I began to look into. So what I discovered is, although we do not know what the very earliest ships look like, by certainly the early historical period, we begin to see some depictions of these ships. And I'm going to show you here a picture of a Satvahana period coin. The Satvahanas ruled over much of peninsular India between the 2nd century BC and the 2nd century AD. And you can see here clearly a depiction of what is an ocean-going ship with 2 masts. It's a coin with clearly that depiction. We have other depictions as well. For example, you have a boat relief of the Bhog Mandap of Jagannath Puri temple. And if you look closely at it, you will see there is something quite interesting about the way the hull is put together. You can see that it is not nailed together, but stitched together. Literally the way clothes are stitched together, that's how ships used to be stitched together. And you have a lot of other texts also mentioning this. You have ancient texts, for example, like the Yukti Kalpataru, which is a text from the 9th century by Raja Bhoj. And it mentions these massive ships. Some of these ships the biggest ones were as big as 176 cubits. That's not a small ship. Even by modern standards, that would have been a large ship. And we know that there were Samanya ships, which were ordinary ships. And there were specialized ships called the Vishesha ships, which were capable of ocean-going voyages. We also have accounts of foreign travelers. For example, Ptolemy from the 1st century, he was a Greco-Roman geographer from living in Alexandria. And he mentions that Indian shipbuilders built a fleet of 2,000 ships. And each of them was capable of accommodating 1,000 troops, horses, vast quantities of supplies. So these are not small ships. These are really big ships. You also have Marco Polo, who mentions a ship with a crew, just the crew of 150 to 300. And he mentions interestingly that these were fastened with iron nails. I'm mentioning this because it is the case that Indians were conversant with ships made by fastening with iron nails. In fact, we were one of the few countries that had the technology for rust-free iron. And yet, for a variety of reasons, we continued to stitch our ships together. You have here, for example, Niccolo Conti, 1400, ships weighing 1,000 tons with 5 sails. Again, I'm mentioning this, these are massive ships by any standards. And just before Vasco da Gama and Columbus were sailing the seas, you have Santo Stefano coming to the Indian Ocean world in 1450 and mentioning the timbers of the ships were stitched together with cords and sails made of cotton. So there is this continuous mentioning of massive ships, and of course the fact that a lot of them were stitched together with rope. So what did these ships look like? So I began to look for depictions of these ships, and the earliest one of a clear Indian merchant ship that I could find was a painting of a sailing ship in cave number 2 in Ajanta. And you can see from the ship that there is three masts, there is a person standing there, and it doesn't have a rudder, it's got these steering oars. It's obviously a artistic depiction, so we can't take it too literally in terms of scale, but you can clearly see that it is a ship of some size that was sailing the seas. And we know that this was an ocean-going ship because there are no rowing oars for taking it forward. It had to be an ocean-going ship. Now, this stitching technique, by the way, lasted all the way through to the 16th century. And eventually, the Indians abandoned this design, not because these ships were inefficient for sailing, but because of cannons. And it was not the other guy's cannons that we were concerned about. The problem was that if you placed these cannons on stitched ships, even the back kick of a cannon, the reverse blast of the cannon, was enough to loosen the ropes so that the ships would not be able to deal. So ultimately, technology moved on, and by the Maratha period, certainly Indians were building their own ships, but they were building them using the nailed ships technique. But this technique did not completely die out. What happened is that this technique is still alive for building small boats like the ones I'm showing you. You can occasionally still find stitched ship boats, small fishing boats along the Indian coasts, on both coasts. But this technique is now rapidly dying out because naturally we are now replacing them with new metal or fiberglass boats or nailed ships. So this technique is very rapidly dying out. So the idea behind what we were trying to do is that before all memory of this stitching technique dies out, we should try to attempt to reconstruct an ancient ship using the Ajanta ship as a kind of a template, and then see if we could sail it across the oceans to recreate how ancient Indians navigated the Indian Ocean and beyond. So the first thing to do, obviously, is to create a sketch. So the first thing we did was we created a schematic sketch of the Ajanta sailing ship. I needed, therefore, to create a proper line drawing so that I could actually begin to think of what this ship may come to actually look like. The problem, obviously, is I'm an economist. I am not a ship designer. As luck turned out, I came in contact with a young ship designer called Hemant. He's in the Indian Navy, but he's not a sailor. He's actually a ship designer. He happened to have been involved in several of our major ships, including our aircraft carrier, Vikrant. And he became very enthusiastic about this project. And so thanks to him, I began to put together a more serious design of what the ship would look like. And this is the design we came up with. This is, as you can see, a design of a ship based on the Ajanta painting, but now take into account much more a serious design of what the ship will look like. We reduced the 3 masts to 2 masts with a foresail, which would be much more sensible. If you have too many masts, actually it gets in the way because the sails begin to cancel out each other's wind. And you can see that we kept many of the old design elements. For example, there is a trailing steering oar rather than a rudder as you would see in a modern ship. It retains the fact that it has square sails. This is important because if you see modern sailing ships, they have lateen sails, triangular lateen sails. This has square sails. Now this is what was used in ancient times. It has certain drawbacks, as I will discuss later, in that you can't sail too much of an angle to the wind, but this is what was used at that time. And the design we came up was for a length of about 21 meters, a breadth of 6.5 meters, a depth of 3.3 meters, approximately 50 tons, with a crew of 18. With that, we began to put the rigging plan together, and then the mast plan. Now, obviously, came the issue of actually building this ship. Now, I began to talk to a lot of people and created a presentation. But then, on one of the occasions, and this is back in 2020, I was making a presentation on some other economic issue to the Honorable Prime Minister, and it was for half an hour, but I made the presentation deliberately in 25 minutes. And at the end of it, I had about 5 minutes left, where I presented this idea of building this ship to recreate ancient Indian maritime history. So the Honorable Prime Minister listened me out, and then he said, after about 30 seconds of silence, he said, "Karo." And then after another 10 seconds, he said, "Par dubna mat." So with that encouragement, I then began to look for who I could get on board with this project. I was very pleased that the Ministry of Culture agreed to do the funding. We got the Ministry of Defense and the Indian Navy. They agreed to both oversee the building, but also to man the crew as and when we did this voyage. We had the Ministry of External Affairs, we had the Ministry of Shipping, many others who supported us. So now we began to put the team together for building it. There was obviously me, and there was Hemant, the designer. So we had designed the ship and come put it together, but we needed a shipyard to take this on. Not an easy thing to do, because it's an ancient ship and nobody has built these ships in hundreds of years. Luckily, Hodi shipbuilders in Divar Island in Goa agreed to do this. And in the course of our search, we also found Babu Sankaran in Kerala, who was a traditional shipbuilder. His ancestors would very likely have built the ships like the one in Ajanta. But, of course, these ships have not been built for generations. Luckily, his grandparents had taught him some of the rules of thumb of building a large ship. And he's literally the last person who has some idea of how to build these larger stitch ships, because his own children are not interested in learning this. So this was a last ditch effort to kind of retain some traditional memory of this skill. So we were very pleased that Babu was a part of our team as well. Now, what do you need to build this? Obviously, you need the wood. There are different kinds of wood for different parts, but we use Anjali, which is wild jack. Now remember, we have only going to use materials that were available 1600 years ago. So the wood is what is available in the Western Ghats. So it was available in India 2000 years ago, so that was fine. Then we need coir rope for stitching. You need coconut fiber for between the planks to stuff them. You need needles for stitching. Kudrus resin. This is the resin, it's a natural gum for basically putting between the wooden joints. Fish oil, because that's what you dissolve the kudrus resin in, and also applied for the durability of wood. Now I was very concerned about the smell of this fish oil, and I was assured that most of it would go away, and it did. But I can assure you, enough of it retains on the ship that you can still smell it, especially if you spend time in the hold. It is very obvious that that's covered in fish oil. And then there's red brick pigment. Now comes the business of actually building this ship. You first lay out the keel. This is important. You see, when you build modern ships, like out of steel, you first build out actually a frame and then you weld the hull onto it. Even when you use wood, you would, if you use a nailed technique, you would typically build a frame and nail the planks on that frame. That's how ships are usually built. But with a stitching technique, you have to change. You actually stitch the ship together onto this keel, and then you retrofit the frame onto it. So what happens as a result of which is that the frame is actually quite small. It just gives it some shape. The whole thing is held together actually by the stitching. So therefore, the stitching is absolutely critical. If that goes wrong, the whole thing falls apart. So how do you go about doing this? How do you shape these planks? So the way to do it is that you put it in a steaming chamber and you steam it for hours on end. And when, after many hours of steaming, the fibers become loose. And so you pull it out very quickly while it is still loose, and you have to, within a minute or two, give it shape. Because after it cools down, it then takes that shape. But it has to be done literally by eye. And Babu Sankaran did the whole thing without measurement. He just did it by eye. I don't know how he did it, but this is how he went about it. Here's a video of how it is done. This is the steaming chamber. We are picking up the steam, as you can see. These are the planks getting pulled out after being steamed. After that, this is how it's shaped. After the steaming, this is the shaping process. As you can see, they have taken this steamed wood and they have literally minutes before it again kind of dries up and takes shape. So they have to do this shaping as soon as they can. So it's being bent, as you can see, and then weights and other things are used. So having done this, you then take the planks and you make holes on them, parallel holes, and you begin to stitch it, as I said, just like you would do with stitching clothes. And then you then take this and then you put kudrus resin applied between the planks to seal them. Otherwise wood, this is stitched, so the water would come in. And then you hammer down the wadding and you do this stitching in an X11, X11 kind of pattern. And then as you begin to build the frame, the planks, you can see the frame, a very light frame is put inside it. This gives it some shape, but this is not, as I said, what holds it together. What holds it together is the stitching. So the stitching is very, very important. And then eventually, when you get to the top, you create these horizontal crossbars, which are also stitched in. So this is how you can see how the stitching took shape over a period of time, and then you coat it with fish oil inside and outside the hull. And this is how the hull construction began to get done. And you can see the outside, it's really a work of artisanal art, as you can see. And there's a lot of thought and technology going into it. So with that, in almost exactly a year ago, we managed to build the hull. And on 26th of February 2025, which happened to be Mahar Shivratri last year, we put the boat into the water. In fact, we did it at midnight because that's when the tide came in. So it was almost exactly at Shivratri moment. And to our great relief, the ship floated. Do remember, all of this is experimental. So we were never sure of anything along the way. So to a great relief, the ship floated. Now came the issue of outfitting it. So you have to create a deck. We don't have cabins because the ship is not that sophisticated, but you do have a hold below and you have a deck. And then you have the masts which are put together. You have all the pulleys and ropes, and the sails are then put inside. Interestingly, we decided to take on a stone anchor from the Harappan period. So remember, the ship I'm building is from the 4th century. That's 1600 years ago, the Gupta period, roughly speaking. But we decided, because we knew what Harappan anchors look like, that we were going to use an anchor which was even 3,000 years older. So this is what they look like. This is what the replica we made. And how does it work? The way it works is, it's basically quite heavy. It's about 80 kgs in weight. The top hole is where the rope goes in, and the bottom 2 holes is where the wooden spikes go through. And that's important because those are the spikes that, when you put it in the water, is what gets caught in the soil, in the mud, or the rocks in the seabed, and holds the ship down. So that is how an ancient ship looked like, and we built one for our ship as well. Little ahistorical, but still interesting. And then came the issue of building the sails. And we decided that we were going to put some ancient Indian motifs on them. We chose the Ganda Berunda, which is a 2-headed bird, as you can see. This, incidentally, was the royal symbol of the Kadambas of Goa. And so we chose that because the ship was obviously built in Goa. It also happens to be today the state symbol of Karnataka, which is interesting because the ship was later on then brought to the Navy base in Karwar, which is in Karnataka. We also chose the Surya, which is a common symbol in Indian art. And then the Simhayali for the front of the bow of the ship, which is a common thing you will see in Chalukya temples. You will see the Simhayali as well. With that, we created the dry docking. We painted it all up, put everything together. And then on the 16th of May, we towed the ship from Goa, where it was built, to Karwar, which is a Navy base, on the 16th of May 2025. This is the first time the ship was taken out to sea, and to see whether it could actually take the buffeting of sea waves. Can I request that these twirling lights are stopped? They are distracting. Yeah. No, just switch them off. Thank you. So now that we have brought this ship to the Navy's INSV, to Navy's Karwar base, on 21st of May 2025, the ship was then formally inducted into the Indian Navy as INSV Kondinya. So, as it happens to be, the ship is now a formal part of the Indian Navy's fleet. It's as much a part of the Indian Navy's fleet as the aircraft carriers and the submarines. It was inducted in the presence of very senior Navy officials, of course, but also the Honorable Minister of Culture, which is fair because, as I told you, the Ministry of Culture had funded the whole project. A few words about the name Kondinya. Why the name Kondinya? The name Kondinya is important because this is the name of the earliest Indian mariner of whom we know of by name. So, about 2000 years ago, we know that there was an Indian mariner, a captain of a ship, sailing along the Mekong Delta, what is now southern Vietnam and Cambodia, when he was attacked by local tribes as pirates perhaps, and he rallied his troops to defend his boat. But of course he is hopelessly outgunned and not outgunned, there were no guns then, but hopelessly trapped because there was this whole tribe that was surrounding him. But nonetheless, he rallied his troops and he fought very bravely against this tribe. It was called the Serpent tribe, a Naga tribe. But things were looking pretty tough when luck suddenly turned in his favor. And what happened is that the leader of the Naga tribe, who was a warrior princess called Soma, saw him and fell in love. And she then proposed marriage to him. Now, I suppose he did not have too much of a choice in the matter, but what we do know is that he then married her and set up the first Hindu kingdom in Southeast Asia. So, Kondinya therefore became a major historical figure. Unfortunately, he's not remembered very much in Indian history. We actually don't know where exactly he came from, as it happens to be. But what we do know is that Kondinya became a major character in Southeast Asian history, and for the next several thousand years, even right down to the present day, all royal families in Southeast Asia, particularly in the Cambodia area, they even today take their lineage back to the marriage of Kondinya with Soma. So with that, we began to take this ship and began to do trials. Now, as you can see there, we had a crew. The Navy very kindly provided me with a crew of 4 officers, 17 sailors, and me for this voyage. We can see that we are training. We trained for several months on this, did sea trials along the coast. And the ship did rather well. So you can see all the crew training September to December. Every long weekend, I'd take a flight from Delhi to Goa and drive down to Karwar and spend 3, 4, 5 days, whatever I could spare, training. And at least on the trials, the ship did rather well. Now, you have to remember that sailing a ship like this is completely different from sailing modern sailing ships. It has a completely different logic. As I said, it does not have a rudder. It has a steering oar. It uses square sails. The hull is flexible because it's stitched together, and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, over the months, we began to understand the ship, and then it was time to attempt our first maiden voyage from Porbandar to Muscat. So as I said right in the beginning, this is a very old sailing route going back to the Harappan period. So we have been sailing from Gujarat to the Middle East for at least 5,000 years. And it is not surprising, therefore, that when His Highness the Sultan of Oman 2 years ago was visiting India, there was a joint statement between His Highness and His Excellency the Prime Minister of India, which stated that the very first voyage of INSV Kondinya would be to Oman. So we decided that it would be from Porbandar to Muscat. And as I said, on the 29th of December 2025, we set off on this voyage. This is the voyage plan. So first we will go obviously to Oman, and then the voyage, we will sail it back. I was to be a part of the maiden voyage. And so on the 29th, we set sail. So this is me plotting the course on the deck on the first morning. As you can see, there's the captain, Vikas Sharon, and Hemant, and that's me in white, pretending to know what I'm doing on that chart. And so, right in the beginning, we faced a major problem. And the problem was that we wanted to sail westward, but the wind was blowing directly from westward. Now, you can imagine this is not a trivial issue, because this is a square sail ship and we cannot sail at too much of an angle to the wind. So if you want to go west and the wind is blowing from the west, you actually can't do very much. It was also very strong winds and was causing the ship to roll quite a lot. And so here we are rolling, I think this is the second day. The young sailor at the left is Bariki, and this is actually not one of the roughest periods. You can get that sailing oar can sometimes, if you get hit a big wave, can literally knock you out. So he almost got knocked off the ship by the steering oar when it sort of recoiled off a big wave. But there were other periods too. Here is a later period, sailing into a local weather system. This is day 12. This is what you mean by fair winds and following seas. As you can see, the waves are behind us, pushing us along. There is this cloud system ahead of us, but it looks beautiful, and we are making 4 knots. So when you get fair winds and following seas, it doesn't roll you around as much as otherwise, as you can see. And of course, sometimes it rains and the weather changes. Do remember that the ship has to be kept running, and there is only a deck, which is an open deck, and there is a hold. At least some of the crew has to be always on the deck running the ship, irrespective of the weather, and there is a continuous 4-hour cycle of watches. So even though there are 18 people on the ship, some of them are obviously sleeping in a cycle, some of them are doing other chores, cleaning and etc. And then even in the best of conditions, at least 4 to 5 people have to be running the ship. But of course, when you have to raise the sail, you need 12, sometimes even the entire crew, if it's a very rough weather, to raise the sail or bring it down, up or down. And then sometimes there's absolutely no wind. Now you may think that, sailors find it difficult when there's a lot of wind and there's a storm. But actually the time that we find the most difficult is glassy seas, when there's absolutely no wind at all. And this is what it looks like when there is no wind. It looks literally glassy. The sails, as you can see, are flat. And this is in some ways the most helpless, because it's not like you aren't moving. There is a current. The current is taking you in whichever direction it wants, very often in not the direction you want to sail. But you can't do anything because there's no wind, there is no power. Remember, there is no engine. So you just have to float with wherever it goes. So we did have along the way several periods where you basically floated ourselves. But in the vastness of the oceans, you get to take some great snaps. This is a snap of us on one such occasion on a glassy seas, floating from a drone that we had taken along with us. And you can see how tiny it really is. 21 meters is not very much. You could easily fit that ship on one row of this. You don't have to even take the whole thing. Just one row of these seats is more than enough to accommodate this ship. Of course, remember, we are sailing in winter. We are getting about 13, 14 hours of darkness. So actually light is less than 12 hours of the day. And as I said, we don't have too many artificial lights. We did carry with us some electricity for lights because we needed to make sure that other ships could see us. So we do have a transponder, and on top of the sails there are some lights. But otherwise there is darkness. And in this darkness, sometimes you have the moon, and on a full moon night you'll be surprised how bright it is. And I'm going to try and show it to you a little later. But you have to raise the sails, you have to run the ship. So how do you do it? So what we did is we used headlamps. But when your eyes get used to absolute darkness, the white light like this looks just too bright. So what you have to do is to use red lamps, which are less painful to the eyes. So I have photographed how it looks hoisting a sail at night using red lamps. But we had also many funny incidences. Here is one instance which was quite funny, at least in retrospect. You see, as I told you right in the beginning, on the first 2.5 days, the wind was blowing directly at us from the west. So there was no way of us to sail outward towards Muscat. So what do? When you have this kind of situation, you cannot actually stay still because the wind is blowing you around. So you have to go somewhere and do something. Otherwise, you lose control of the ship. You can't stay in one place. And you can't anchor. Once you're out at sea, the seabed is way too deep. So what do? So we decided to sail north because that was the only direction in which we could get some speed and control over the ship. So we started from Porbandar, as I said, and we kept going north. So first we went past the Gulf of Kutch, and then we kept going north till we began to approach the Pakistan border at Sir Creek. So as we began to approach Pakistan, which is now about 15 nautical miles or so, there is a lot of fishing that happens in that area. It's a very, very fishing-rich territory. And there are lots of Indian fishing boats not far from the creek. And they saw our ship approaching, and they had never seen a ship like this. They were unfamiliar with it. So suddenly we hear all this chatter on channel 16. That's the emergency channel, which is an open channel. We could also hear it, but we could hear them basically screaming to the Indian Coast Guard, mentioning that there is a strange ship, very likely a Pakistani intruder, that was sailing through this and heading towards heading towards the Pakistan border. And literally they said, "Yahan Pakistan ka ek parda wala jahaz chal raha hai aur maal leke bhag raha hai." So they kept doing this to us, and very quickly we had about 10 or 15 of these fishing trawlers which were following us up towards Sir Creek, which was quite funny. It's good to know that Indian fishermen keep track of any intruders in the area. Not a trivial thing given what had happened in Mumbai in 2611. So they are in some ways our first line of defense. But of course, they simply refused to believe us when we told them that we were a replica 2,000-year-old ship. Thankfully, the Indian Navy eventually came over the line and clarified to them that this was fine, and then they left us. But them leaving didn't solve the problem because the wind was still blowing towards us, and we were still sailing north. So finally, because we were getting too dangerously close to the territorial waters of Pakistan, we then switched direction. We still couldn't sail west, so we decided to sail south. But the wind direction was such that it was blowing us back towards land. So here we are on 31st of December, 2025, New Year is approaching, and we still have made no progress towards Oman at all. Wind is in fact blowing us inwards towards Gujarat coast. Thankfully, we went to sleep somewhat depressed on 31st night after having a small celebration on board. I was sleeping on the deck. By the way, the place you sleep on is the deck most of the time. You can sleep in the hold between the provisions, but it's better to sleep on the deck. So I was sleeping on the deck. It was still just about before dawn, and I woke up for whatever reason, and I suddenly saw the flag was waving from the northeast. That was the moment. The wind had changed. And I got up, I screamed to the captain, Vikas jumped up, whole crew jumped up, we raised the sail, and off we were towards Muscat on the 1st. And that was quite a moment. And from then on, we got off and on decent winds. And as I said, we then took about almost 18 days to make the crossing to Muscat. So what was life like on board? So what was eating like? Well, as I said, there's nothing modern on the ship except some communications devices. And so after about 5-6 days, all the fresh rations ran out. So fruits, vegetables, everything, naturally you can't, either you ate them or it'll go rotten. So by the 6th day, all the fresh rations were done. And so for the next 11 odd days, we sailed on what is called dry rations. You can do khichdi, Maggi, DRDO provided us with some dry stuff you could heat up, and so on and so forth. So that is basically what we ate. Let me tell you, I will not be eating Maggi for a long time. And so here we are on the deck. That's how we used to eat. Basically, some khichdi, some achar. We tried thepla, by the way, which works quite well. It's a good dry ration. We did experiment, however, with some things. For example, we had taken along with us sprouts. Now, obviously, that's a dry ration, but you can put some in fresh water and it kind of sprouts. And you can put some salt and ginger in it. And so that was a relief. On the 10th or 11th day, we had something that tasted a little fresh. So that was what we ate. 2 meals a day, by the way. All meals have to be eaten while it is still light, because cooking in the darkness isn't fun. Then you can see that we had a hold. That's what the hold looks like. That's where we mostly kept our provisions. But there was some space there. And especially in the day when it was very bright and hot, if you were off your watch, how do you sleep? You can't sleep out. It's hot, humid, bright sunshine. So those who had time off in the daytime would come down into the hold. And even though it's clearly very uncomfortable, you would just crash and go to sleep. Sometimes sleeping on the deck could be quite romantic. On a full moon night, this is what it looked like with the wind blowing, the sail, and but then you could also have a very windy, wet night with spray coming off and things rattling. And on those nights, you still had to sleep there, so this is what it would feel like. You'll probably be able to see Captain Chevron and me sleeping. Our blankets, the red one is Captain, the guy next to him is Hemant, and there is the person next to him is me sleeping on the deck. Of course, you could wake up being completely wet on the outside because of dew as well, not just the spray. I know everybody is very interested in this. This is the toilet. There were 2 of them, and this is how it works. There were 2 baskets, like the ones you see, on either side, and they hang outside the ship. And the way they are used is, effectively, you have to jump off the ship into this, trying to avoid the hole in the middle. That would be awkward if you fell through it. And then you did what you had to. Then you put a bucket on a string into the sea, pull it out, wash yourself, and then you had to climb back up into the ship. Remember, this is suspended outside the ship, and it's the ship itself is about at eye level. So you had to literally hold it from the sides and haul yourself in, and you had to do it maybe 5-6 times a day. And remember, a few times at least every day, you would have to do it in absolute darkness while the ship is pitching and rolling all over the place, waves coming over, and so on and so forth. And do remember, if by chance you fell off, then your best chance was to start swimming towards Porbandar. Because this is a sailing ship, we have nothing modern on board, there is literally no way of going and retrieving you. We did later on build a harness to kind of hold ourselves because after some time we realized that this was kind of dangerous. And in fact, the joke was that if you went to the toilet in Sea State 4, you got a Mahavir Chakra. If you went to the toilet at Sea State 5, you got a Paramvir Chakra. And anything above Sea State 6 and above was Veer-Gati. We also saw a lot of wildlife. Here are some dolphins. There are also something called phytoplankton. In case you're unaware what this is basically plankton which actually glows in the dark if you disturb it. And so we discovered that you could take buckets of water and pour it back into it, and you'll literally get something akin to a firework.
One more. One more. One more.
So we had our own fireworks as well, and it's really quite stunning. Imagine yourself literally out of sea. You're on a sailing boat which is sort of making its way. You're not very, these boats, you're quite close to the water, by the way. These are not high. And you get to see all of these things literally in touching distance. Here are some sunsets we saw. Here is the Simhalayali with the sunset that we witnessed. But we also witnessed some moonrises. Living in cities, you do not realize that the moon, especially when it's a full moon, can be really bright. You can literally read by moonlight. That's how bright it is when it is moonlight. And this is actually a moonrise. This is not a sunrise. This is how bright it looks like. Now, how did the voyage go? How was the actual sailing path? Well, Porbandar to Muscat is, if you by straight line, is 650 nautical miles. That's about little less than 1,200 kilometers. But obviously, we are a sailing boat. We didn't go directly across. Depending on the wind, we went back, forward. I told you about us sailing north, south, east, etc. So we actually covered more than 1,500 kilometers. That's 836 nautical miles in order to be able to reach Muscat. This is a photograph of the crew. As I said, it included 4 Navy officers, about 12 sailors, 1 medic, and 1 random economist. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I come to the end of my lecture. Thank you very much.
Hello, heartiest congratulations, sir. And very inspiring. I was following you on the Twitter, your everyday updates. So I have been much familiar with the videos that you are showing. So myself, Rajesh, what I wanted to know is that what inspired actually, the first thought that came to your mind. That's very courageous, and that's what attracted me here today. So what prompted you to think that?
To what? Build the ship or sail it?
To sail it.
To sail it?
Start the journey. Yeah, of course.
Okay.
I mean, when you think of the idea of sailing, then you build it.
Okay, so the original inspiration was the idea that, the colonial view of history, which we have very often perpetuated even today, is that somehow Indians were a strange people. The colonial view of history, oddly, is that somehow Indians were afraid of the oceans and of crossing the oceans. And we were told these colonial stories to give us a sense that Indians never explored the oceans at all. But in fact, when you explore Indian history, or in fact that of Southeast Asia and so on, one of the things that strikes you is that Indian history cannot be understood except through by taking into account the maritime lens. I mean, those of you who studied Indian history in the textbooks, hardly anything of Indian maritime history is taught to you. Maybe you will hear about the Chola raids on Southeast Asia. That's it. So I began to investigate this, and I found that this was very deeply ingrained. There's books written, just published less than 10 years ago, by well-known authors like Charles Allen, for example. It's a book called Coromandel. Some of you may have read it. It's a book on India's coastal history. And in the very first paragraph, it starts by saying that the Indians are somehow strange people, that they're surrounded by the seas, but except for the Cholas, they never explored the oceans. Now, effectively what you do then is to simply negate our entire maritime history. In fact, our whole history completely. Whereas I thought it was important, and this is something I began to do with my book, Ocean of Churn, to begin to look at Indian history from a completely different lens. And it turns out that Indian history is full of maritime, travel, trade, and so on. And it's on both coastlines, by the way. There's major ports not from Kolkata, Tamluk, Tamralipti, and Chandraketugarh. So there were ports all over the coast, through Odisha all the way onto the other coast in Gujarat and Kerala and so on. So, as one thing is to, of course, write about it, which I did in that book. But I thought you needed to do something else to really capture the imagination of the next generation. And very importantly, to open up maybe through an area of research which is very underdeveloped in India, which is experimental archaeology. So experimental archaeology is about going, and it's common in the rest of the world, where they recreate ancient technology or some artifact and use it to see what happens. So I thought maybe what we should do is maybe initiate in India for the first time an entire cycle of experimental archaeology. So that's how the ship got built. Then came the question of whether or not to sail it. Now I was very keen right from the beginning that we should sail it. And of course, in order to convince other people to sail on a ship designed by an economist who has never designed a ship, meant that I had to have skin in the game. So right from the beginning, I made it clear to everybody that I will be in it myself. If I'm not convinced that it can cross the Indian Ocean, then I'm not going to ask anybody else to take the risk and do it. So that is why I was on that ship myself.
Sanjeev here.
Yeah, the ship is right now in Muscat. It's being checked to see whether all the stitching is still intact. And then somewhere in February, we will sail it back to Karwar. And then the idea is, if it's still in good shape, where we'll really have a relook. End of the year, we are thinking of doing something on the east coast, probably coinciding with Kartik Purnima, maybe from Odisha, recreating maybe the Bali Jatra. Let's see. But it will depend on the condition of the ship.
Congratulations to you and the entire crew. Can you just elaborate a bit on the practice you did before sailing?
Okay.
The preparation practice, and the last part is, what was the celebrations like once you reached Muscat, from the Indian side and from the Oman side?
Okay.
Thank you.
So, the preparations, of course, the most important thing to realize is that the crew provided by the Navy did include several very high quality sailors, some of them with national medals and international medals as well. But, as I told you right in the beginning, they had to almost relearn sailing, because this ship has a completely different logic from modern sailing ships that are used for competitions and so on. It does not have a deep keel. It has a flexible stitched hull. It uses a steering oar rather than a rudder. It has square sails and many other things. I mean, I can spend a whole evening on how it's different. So we had to take it out for these series of sea trials and over again. So in fact, in the beginning, we just got towed out to some safe distance from the shore and then basically experimented to see how the ship would behave when you did various things to it. And I actually would go down whichever long weekend. So for example, on the Diwali weekend, this last Diwali was a nice long weekend. And so I went there and spent 5 days attempting to sail. It was, by the way, a stormy period along the west coast. So we got knocked around quite a bit. But we learned how to deal with it. Then was, of course, the issue of fitness. We all had to have military-grade fitness, but of course, do remember that I was by some margin the oldest person on the ship. Most of the crew, by the way, had parents who were younger than me. So I couldn't let them down. So I also made sure that I was of the same level of fitness that I could take a ship, this crossing. It's physically exhausting. The ship is continuously rolling back and forth, as I said. Just getting in and out of the toilet, as I pointed out to you, was not a trivial thing. And then, of course, raising the sails, bringing it down the sails, going in and out of the hull in heavy weather. Doing even daily tasks like changing your clothes while you're being rocked around, or things like that, or all of this meant, and it's happening day after day after day. It's not for a few hours, and we reached in 17, 18 days, but we had to be physically fit to last whatever length of time it took. So if it took took 25 days and we would have had to be there. So we really had to be clear that our fitness was good, and I took all the same fitness tests as the rest of the crew. About the welcome, yes, we did get a grand welcome when we reached Oman. The Omanis put on a grand show. There was a large number of traditional boats which accompanied us into the harbor. We got a water cannon entry, and hundreds of members of both the Omanis or also the Indian community in Oman also turned up for the welcome ceremony, as did indeed both my mother and wife, who are here in the front, who also came to Muscat to receive us. Thank you.